So we're live again, Supervisor Bailey. We have another virtual town hall. Supervisor Bailey, this is about, I think, our 9th town hall now.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening to the wonderful community of Prince William County. We are excited about this evening. We have very special guests with us this evening to talk about a very important and special item. And we have our own Congressman Connally with us. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. We have our Commonwealth attorney, Amy Ashworth, that's joined us as well. We have the president of the NAACP for Prince William County, Cozy Bailey. Thank you for joining us. And we have our newly elected, appointed, wonderful Tracy Lenox, who is our public defender for the Prince William County area. Tracy, congratulations and welcome. And as our moderator this evening, we have Pastor William Archer, and I'm going to turn it over to him to usher us into a really warm and wealth of knowledge conversation. Pastor Archer, if you will, please.
Absolutely. It really is an honor to be with all of you and to be a part of this conversation. I know that there's so much that's gone on this year. 2020 has been an unprecedented year, without a doubt, in our country. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're having some serious conversations around justice and policing. And it's really an honor to be with a distinguished group like this, to have this conversation. And to everyone that's joining us on YouTube Live, we're glad that you could join us and join the conversation. These are your elected officials. These are my elected officials. And we're really honored to be able to ask real questions and have a real conversation tonight. Congressman Connally, I know that you have just co-sponsored the Justice and Policing Act with the Congressional Black Caucus. And I thought it might be helpful if we started off with you just telling us a little bit. You represent us here in this community about that act and about your thoughts behind that as a precursor to our kind of diving deeper into our local situation.
Thanks so much, Reverend Archer. And let me just describe what the bill does. This is, I think, a profound first step in getting at structural reform, not at the margins reform of law enforcement in America. So this bill, which passed the House, prohibits racial profiling in policing, bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants in drug cases, requires that deadly force be used only as a last resort, and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques by being trained in it first. It limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement so that they're not using, overpowering lethal military-style weapons in law enforcement. It requires law enforcement to wear body cameras and to use dashboard cameras if they wish to receive federal funds. It makes it a crime for federal law enforcement officers to engage in a sexual act with an individual who's under arrest and detention or in custody. It requires the collection of data on police misconduct to prevent problem officers from changing jurisdictions to avoid accountability. We saw this as a big problem in Ferguson, where the police officers involved had been fired because of brutality and other complaints in other law enforcement entities in the Missouri area, but there was no record of it, and Ferguson went ahead and hired them.
Absolutely.
And it provides grants to communities to establish policing reform commissions. It strengthens the ability of the Department of Justice and state attorneys general to investigate problematic police departments, and it creates a database on the use of lethal force all across America for the first time. And then finally, this bill does not provide any additional federal funding for police departments except for data collection, and in fact, reprograms existing funding to empower communities to help shape the future of policing. This bill, as you said, was written first by the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus. I was one of the early original co-sponsors, proud to do it. And as I said, this is a down payment on what we see as the need for fundamental structural reform of policing in America.
Absolutely. That's very, very, very important. Why do you think it's so critical at this time that we have this conversation? You know, there are many that would say we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're dealing with the reality of social injustice really being highlighted in our country. Some would say this is a time for healing and not a time for discussions around structural reform. Why would you say that this would be a time for this kind of measure to move even beyond the House to the Senate and then to be fully embraced?
You know, I think of Martin Luther King talking about injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere.
Right.
There is no convenient time for addressing injustice or to promote justice. And I think the tragedy of George Floyd's murder at the hands of a police officer who had 19 complaints filed against him, I might add, and got nothing but a slap in the wrist. In fact, the worst that ever happened to him was a piece of paper was put in his file noting that he had been reprimanded.
Right.
And I think there's a connection between that tragedy and the inequity that was exposed in this pandemic.
Right.
We're looking at, well, let's talk about the African-American community for a minute. The rate of infection among Black Americans is 3 times the rate of infection among white Americans. And, and the mortality rate is more than twice that of white Americans. Now, how can that possibly be, except that we're talking about lower paid jobs that require them to go to work and expose them to people who are infected, public transportation because they don't have other ways of getting to work, lack of access to healthcare, and crowded housing. And that's a combination for a lot of people of color that is lethal, is killing them. And I think that inequity combined with this tragedy in Minneapolis kind of lit a fuse. It was too much. And I will say this finally, I'm somebody who was a child of the protests in the late 1960s and early 70s. Both civil rights and anti-Vietnam War. The difference between then and now is that we have public opinion with us. Public opinion, almost by 2/3 in America, says, no, I stand with the protesters and I agree with the proposition that we have structural racism in America that has to be rooted out, and we should start with the police.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. To that point, I know that Reverend Bailey, you are the president of our local chapter of the NAACP. What are your thoughts around this? Just as a key voice in the African American community.
Well, thank you for that, Will, and hello to everyone. I try to be a voice, Will. I'm not sure that I'm the key voice, but I try to be a loud voice. I kind of agree. Well, I definitely agree with all that Congressman Connally has said. And for me, as I've spoken to a variety of groups over the past month or so, what continues to come to my mind is a scripture from the Book of Esther. And really shortly, it's about, the story of Queen Esther, being a Jew who was part of the royal courtroom, if you will, of the king. And she was very nervous about being in that position. And more atrocities were about to be visited upon the Jews. And Queen Esther was not sure what to do, but her trusted confidant Mordecai told her, and loosely said, the scripture says, who knows, but for such a time as this, you were placed in the position that you were placed in. And I embody that. Who knows that for such a time as this, I was placed in the position that I was placed in as president of NAACP, and Supervisor Bailey was placed in the position that she's in for such a time as this, and Prosecutor Ashworth and Public Defender Lenox all were placed in the position that they're in, that we are all in for such a time as this. The combination of these twin crises that we're in, the pressures that we feel, we all come together at this time in order to do something, in order to bring people together. As the Congressman said, And he quoted, one of my heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King, when he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And everybody knows that part of it. But what Martin Luther King went on to say behind that was, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. What he was talking about is that we are meant to live in community, and we need to stand up and do something to seize this moment and to make a change now.
Absolutely.
Can I just add one more thing, Will?
Sure, absolutely,
I
please.
feel pretty passionate about this. And there's a burden on the white population to speak up. This cannot be only a Black or a brown issue. The whole country needs to hear from people who look like me, that we stand with our African-American brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters, to stand out this kind of violent racism that has been allowed to dominate America for almost 400 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And this virus of vitriol is definitely infected our country for a very, very long time, for 400 years. And we've seen it play out over the past several years in profound ways. I really appreciate what Reverend Bailey was saying there as he talked about this idea of such a time as this. And I'm honored to have, and for all of us to be able to have a conversation with our Commonwealth's attorney, with our public defender, with our supervisor, and really talk about what this looks like for our community. Supervisor Bailey, you're the one that convened all of us to have this conversation. And I think for many of us, it's hard to get a sense of what's going on in the world or what's even going on in the country, but we might have a better handle on what's going on in our local community. And so I'd like to ask you, Supervisor Bailey, what are your thoughts about how we need to engage here on a local level? Congressman Connally has co-sponsored legislation that's on a national level that will have local impact. But what are your thoughts here on a local level in terms of how we engage to really see substantive change around community policing?
So I appreciate the question, Pastor Will. Let me say, I want to go back to something you said in the question. You've brought us all together. And the reason why I asked this wonderful group of people to come together tonight is because they get it. They understand it. And they understand the importance of removing the fear of having to help by partnering with our police, helping our police departments to improve. They get removing the fear of communicating with a wonderful congressman like Gerry Connally, who is open and courageous to walk in communities of color, to give his heart to make a difference. And my lawyer friends, my wonderful lawyer friends, they get it, why it's important when we have a community of minorities that are incarcerated, that need help from a health perspective, from a legal perspective, from a social justice perspective. These women get it. And so that is the reason why local government, we have to be courageous to reach our hands out to these individuals to help them understand the needs. Reach out to the police department. I mean, I'll share with you, about a month ago, we had, as the protests began in Prince William County, we had an opportunity with the police department as community leaders to come with them to help them to understand different cultures and different lingos and why we were protesting. And we had an opportunity to work with them to navigate those protests, to help the First Amendment right of every individual to go forward, but help our police to be a part of that rather than be outside of that. And so I think when you talk about local government, it's very much important that we help to remove the fear of inequity. Right. We help to remove the fear of respect. We help to remove the fear of different cultures actually living in a community together, rather than separating communities because of the culture. So I just want to say that I feel like I'm one of the catalysts for the group of individuals like my esteemed colleagues here who get it. We have to get that racism is wrong. And we have to get that, inequity in healthcare is just wrong. We have to get that inequity in voting rights or lack of or suppressing voter rights is just wrong. And so that's the starting point, and not sweep it under the rug and pretend like it's not there anymore, because it is there. And so when you have the bill that Congressman Connally brought forth with the CBC, and when you have the need for a public defender, and we see the need and we address the need by working with our governor to make sure that the need is addressed, you have to own it with courage. You cannot, Stephen Covey said, feel the fear and do it anyway.
Right.
Humanity is at stake. So that is the reason why I asked my friends to be on the line today, so that the community understands that we get it and we're willing to share what we get and understanding it.
Absolutely. And, as we're talking about these issues around reforming policing, we're really blessed to be able to have our Commonwealth's attorney with us. As you mentioned, somebody that really gets it and really cares about what's going on, but also someone who's charged with prosecuting, folks that make choices that are destructive, or maybe they haven't made those choices, but they're being brought into a court setting. Attorney Ashworth, I just wanted to ask you if you can explain for everyone that's watching us on YouTube and everyone that's joining us on Facebook a little bit about your office, and because by the time someone interacts with your office, I'm sure they're well aware of your office, but we want to make sure we really understand your office. And also, if I can ask Public Defender Lenox, if you can explain your office. There's a newness to your office that for us here in Prince William County. We haven't had a public defender, and I'm excited about all the promise that your office holds. But if you can explain your offices to us in the context of this conversation around reforming policing. And I would like to ask Amy, if you wouldn't mind going first and telling us a little bit about your office.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm happy to. And thank you, Supervisor Bailey, for putting this town hall together. I think it's an incredibly important mission to bring this kind of information to the public and the community that we all serve. I am the Commonwealth's attorney for Prince William County. That means I'm the chief prosecutor for this jurisdiction and for Manassas and Manassas Park and all the towns within there. So we deal with about 7 law enforcement agencies that work within Prince William County, Manassas and Manassas Park. Our responsibility is to prosecute the cases and to advise the police on when to charge, what to charge. And we have the ultimate say over whether charges go forward, how many charges, what cases, if there's going to be a plea agreement or a plea and recommendation offered to the defendant, and to try those cases. Now, in the code, it refers to my position as being the chief law enforcement officer of a jurisdiction, but my office doesn't actually go into the police department and control their policies. We can certainly, give guidance, and we can say we're not going to use certain evidence that's collected in a certain way, which should affect how the police department operates. And I'm happy to say I've met with almost all of the chiefs. We kind of had our meetings curtailed a little bit by the COVID virus. But I'm in regular communication with Manassas City Police Chief Doug Keene and the new acting chief, Jared Phelps with Prince William County, about all of these issues. And so right now we have 29 prosecutors in Prince William County that handle all of the cases. And that's everything from your murder cases to your speeding cases. So that's generally what we do in that office.
So that's really important, because I think it's important for folks to know that in the code, you're the chief law enforcement officer in our jurisdiction. And so as we're talking about policing, we're talking to you. So you're charged with with being the chief law enforcement officer and prosecuting those cases, or advising how those cases would be prosecuted, or supervising those who are prosecuting the cases. But many folks that are in difficult straits, or are not able to have the kind of representation that some are able to afford, now have the privilege of having a public defender and a public defender's office who would be speaking in some cases at the other side against your prosecutorial officers that you have in place. So if you wouldn't mind, just to tell us a little bit about your new office, Public Defender Lenox. Tell us a little bit about what you do, and now how these two parts will work together as we're talking about this for the citizens of Prince William County and the towns in our jurisdiction.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to be here to talk about this. This is the Public Defender's Office was created in Prince William County because the community demanded it. This is
Right.
It's a entity that the Prince William County has wanted for decades, that had been blocked for decades. This office will have 24 attorneys. I haven't started hiring all of them yet, but it'll have 24 attorneys and 48 staff total. It will be a client-centered office, meaning that the needs and the values of our clients are going to drive everything we do in that office.
Right.
So it's client-centered, but it's also community-based. The office is going to be accountable to our community. We're going to be physically present in our community, and we're going to be drawing on the support of the community. In fact, a lot of the people in this room right now to help us to fulfill our mission as public defenders in Prince William County. We're on the front lines of this. We're the people that are going to be standing up and defending the, unfortunately, indigent defense is largely the defense of Black and brown people.
Right.
It's just the fact of it. Go stand in a courtroom any day and you can
Yep.
see that. And so we are there to be that front line of defense for people, to protect both their dignity and their rights. And part of that, from my perspective, having been in this community for 27 years, is that we need to be having a serious conversation about whether everything that law enforcement does now really ought to be done by law enforcement. And this is a local issue. It's incredibly important that we start talking about mental health and substance abuse and other issues being handled in different ways. It is to take nothing from the professionalism and the well-meaning of our law enforcement in Prince William County and the cities. It has to do with where should we be trying to attack the problems that are created by systemic racism in Prince William County. And I intend to be that voice along with the rest of you, but the Public Defender's Office is going to be there, and we're going to be at the front of this.
Yeah, that's
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Yes, please.
So I'm struck by something as I'm sitting here looking at the faces around here, okay? I'm reminded about how my wife and I, when we first came back to Virginia for the last time to stay, we were living in Fairfax County, and we got some lessons in grassroots politics and criminal justice and social activism from Gerry Connally. And I'm struck by how in the campaign year 2019, we got to know both Amy and Tracy as they were running for office. I'm struck by the fact, again, in this concept of, for such a time as this, we all know each other. We all know each other very well. We know that we are aligned. We know that Tracy and Amy are not antagonists, but they are partners to proper criminal justice in this area. I know that I serve on the jail board with Amy and Tracy, and we all are working together in order to ensure that those who end up incarcerated have the best care that they have, the best training that they have, and the best reformation that they have. I am struck by this concept for such a time as this. We must strike now and move forward. I'm just inspired. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. No, I think that's exactly right. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Was that Congressman? Were you?
Yeah, I was, but I think, Amy, if you were seeking recognition, go ahead.
I was going to say, when Tracy was appointed, I called her up as soon as I found out, and I, welcomed her to the fight, because Tracy and I are on the same side. We both want justice. We want the right thing to happen in each case. And I completely agree that, we can do that and still respect somebody's dignity and still, you know, respect their constitutional rights and do it in a fair and ethical and impartial manner. And that's important to me.
So if I could just add a few
Please.
things to what we've been saying, and Tracy, I am so glad you're there. It makes my heart sing that we're going to have that capability,
Yeah.
because without people like you, their justice is only half built.
Yeah.
But let me just say, police departments have a culture of impunity. And that culture of impunity has been reinforced by district attorneys all over America, including right here in Northern Virginia. Amy, I don't know if you know the statistic, but your predecessor, how many cases against a police officer did he ever bring to trial or charge?
Very few.
In Fairfax, his counterpart in the longest serving Commonwealth attorney in Virginia, zero. Even when people were killed, even when police clearly violated the law, buzzing through a red light without their sirens or lights on and killed someone, even when a cop chased down somebody from another jurisdiction to his driveway and in a mistaken identity shot him dead. Even when cops were drinking and driving, and on, not one. And that reinforced the idea of impunity instead of accountability.
Right.
Every one of us has to be held accountable. No one is above the law.
Yes.
And when in the past, too many DAs or Commonwealth's attorneys, as we call them in Virginia, turn a blind eye when a cop kind of fibbed or perjured himself or herself on the stand to convict somebody. After all, we got a conviction and they were guilty. Or when we, instead of what Amy and Tracy both said, our job is to seek justice. It isn't to rack up a bunch of pellets on the wall called convictions at almost any price. If you find that person is innocent, then don't prosecute them.
Yeah.
And that is not the culture we've lived with for a long, long time. And I'm here to tell you that until and unless we change that culture fundamentally, both in law enforcement and in the justice system, racism will continue its steady pace. These are very important things that don't get a lot of attention because most people don't go to jail or don't go to court, don't experience this system, especially in the white community. And when they do, they're shocked, often. There are plenty of police who are wonderful people, most of them, but the culture they enter into reinforces everything we are concerned about tonight. And it's, you don't want to be a snitch. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to correct somebody who's your senior. You don't want to tell me I've been in the force 20 years. I know what I'm doing, kid. And let me tell you, what you learned in the academy is not what you need to learn on the street. And it's moving from a culture of warrior. I'm a warrior, putting on that badge and that uniform, going out to battle every day. Well, no, you're not. You're a protector and a guardian. That's your role. And the final point I'd say is everything Tracy said about sort of taking away functions of the police department that are not theirs. Police officers are not therapists. Police officers are not drug rehabilitators. Police officers aren't, domestic abuse negotiators and arbitrators. And yet these burdens fall on them.
Yeah.
They do.
Because we have not sufficiently invested in the safety net of human services we ought to be doing. And certainly, Andrea and I have talked about this in Prince William. We've got to do that in Prince William. We've got to strengthen that safety net and take some of those burdens off our police so they can get back to their role of protecting and guarding the communities they serve.
Yeah.
I think that's so critical, and I've been having a lot of conversations, Congressman, with police officers and others who serve in law enforcement, both in my congregation and in the community around these issues. And I agree with you. I think we need accountability. And I support the fact that there's legislation that's being put forward. And I'm very encouraged, as Reverend Bailey said, that we have a public defender's office. We have a Commonwealth attorney that's passionate about working collaboratively for justice. I wonder, as we're talking about taking these burdens off, and I could not agree more with just from my conversations with law enforcement officers. What are your thoughts? And I'm putting this to the entire dais here. What are your thoughts around the care for our police officers? Because this act of investing in human services in a much greater way is really an act of care for our law enforcement officers, who are really carrying, one, the culture that you described is very real, but two, the burden that they carry is also very real. And what are your thoughts here about the investments that we should make as a community over the next 5 or 10 years in human services, so that we don't put an undue burden on police officers, and so that we can really help to change the culture around the relationship between communities and law enforcement? And I would love to put that question to Amy first, since she's a chief law enforcement officer. Amy, I'd love to ask you that question first. How do we change this dynamic for you and for everyone that you work alongside and work with?
Well, thank you. And I'd love to feel that, because I have a lot of ideas on how we can do that. You know, one of the things that tie up the police departments for long periods of time are dealing with mentally ill people.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, we absolutely need to find another solution to dealing with that. Another thing that I'm going to go out on a limb and say is we got to start decriminalizing a lot of this, especially drug use. And I'll tell you, I get a daily rundown every day from the different police departments. And one thing I noticed was the bike unit, where they ride around on bicycles. A lot of their time was taken up with the odor of marijuana. And that would result in multiple arrests each rundown. Well, July 1st, that stopped. And the last rundown I saw, it was all about helping community members. They found some children who were lost. They helped reunite them with their caretakers. And they were doing good in the community. And I thought to myself, after I read that, I bet they feel better, you know, about the work that they did that day. A lot of the police officers that we're dealing with in our community are really good people.
Yes, they are.
And they want to help the community. I think the problem is, first, you know, every day that they go to work, they're dealing with a population of troublemakers, and they're seeing the worst in people every day. And we have to find a way to give them a break from that, so that they don't become disillusioned that everybody's a bad guy, everybody's a danger. And, you know, kind of switching out their roles within the department, I think would be helpful. But I'm all for, you know, focusing on the crimes that cause the most harm, the violent crimes. But I think we really have gotten a little too over involved in people's lives with the police department. And I think taking that burden off them would be a tremendous help.
Absolutely. Other thoughts in this regard?
Yeah, Pastor Will, I'd like to say one of my passions in serving is mental health. And the Board of County Supervisors was very much focused on providing funding for services in our Department of Social Services to upgrade funding so that the services can be enriched. And so one of the things that I really focused on, along with our chair, Aaron Wheeler, was making sure that the funding was there for the assistance that would ride along with the police when they are doing arrest with someone that has a mental health issue. And as the Commonwealth attorney said, you know, that's not their job to deal with that. And so you have to have the revenue, the funding there to hire the expert that is their job. They are trained to be mental psychologists and psychiatrists and to address issues of that nature. And so it's important we've got this terminology that's floating around the air that says we need to defund the police. You don't
Mhm.
need to defund the police.
No, we
You
don't.
might, no, we might need to allocate the funding in different areas to
Yes.
make sure that the funding is spent in a more focused way. But when you talk about social services, as Congressman Connally was saying, you got to make sure that you are funding in the places where you can serve the entire community. You got to make sure that you have a respite place for the police, for them to go when they are suffering mentally. Got to make
Right.
sure that that's addressed as well. Because when you talk about an officer that's been on the job for 30, 40 years, you know, you got to make sure that you're preserving, you're taking care of that person, as well as you got to make sure that you're providing funding in the incarceration environment, that there is reform there.
Right.
There's true reform there, and that's not, because that's humanity in those spaces as well. Those are misled people, or people that just have done bad things, or people that have not done bad things. But reformation is real important, and so the funding has to be there for that. And so the training as well, you know, another buzzword that we take for granted every day, diversity inclusion. Okay, well, so what does that mean? Diversity inclusion, and what does that look like? And so my husband and I were very deliberate about helping the police department understand cultures. And there's training that can help them understand cultures. Prince William County, we've got over 40 different cultures, and probably more than that, in this community. And so we have to assist and help make sure that the funding is there when you talk about diversity and inclusion for our police departments or our staff to understand the different cultures in our communities. And so I believe that from the Board of County Supervisors place, that is our job, to make sure that the funding is there to support that. But also to, once we provide the funding, that we're working alongside these subject matter experts to make sure that that funding is used in the right way.
Right.
And so the funding is not the answer. That's just a buzzword, but making sure that the funding is allocated properly so that it serves the entire community. So I think that's essential.
Yeah, that's
Well, let
really.
me pick up on that thread, if you
Yeah,
would,
please do.
Supervisor
Absolutely.
Bailey. When she talked about the 40 or so or more different, cultures in here, most of those are people of color. A buzzword that we use that I never use tries to describe the diversity that we have here in Prince William County. The fact of the matter is we got more people of color than we got white people in Prince William County. And but when you look at our police department, it doesn't look like that.
Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't look like that from top to bottom. I am all for providing for and caring for our police department. That's why when I was asked to serve on our Citizens Advisory Board here and then asked to be the chairman, I jumped at that opportunity. My younger brother used to be a cop back in St. Louis. My heroes in my neighborhood were cops. But what people need to understand is that when you look at the majority of people here in Prince William County being people of color, that people of color have had largely negative interactions with the police departments for ages and decades. And so there is a natural mistrust. One of the ways to solve that is to, be even more deliberate on ensuring that this police department looks like the community that it serves. That's just, another, as Supervisor Bailey said, buzzword. That's a very important step. Now, the police department here has done a pretty good job. However, they are imperfect and there are things that they can do better, and we should strive to help them do that better. Yes, we should always start with taking care of our police department. They are meant to protect and serve. Congressman Connally, used a term talking about how the police culture and how it has become more and more militarized. We need to ensure that this police department here, and I'm talking about this police department, right? And the ones in the counties and the cities here, because this is where I live and this is where I'm doing my thing and trying to fight for social justice. Okay, right. We need to ensure that they don't cross that line into militarization, and that they in fact continue to protect and serve. We need to ensure that they are funded properly for the things that they are supposed to do. Name some things that they get into that they shouldn't be into.
And can I just say,
Resource officer. Go
can
ahead.
I just, following up on what Cozy said, Will, going way back to your question,
Mhm.
to me, the first part of the answer is get to know and care about your community.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of our police in Northern Virginia don't live in the communities in which they serve.
Right.
And so that's a handicap from day one. If it's your neighborhood and you're paying the taxes and you see, you know, what your kids and family and neighbors and friends are exposed to every day, right off the bat, it gives you a different perspective.
Right.
But if you can't live in the community, we need to immerse people who are in the police academy for an extended period of time to get to know and adopt that community as their own.
Right.
And so automatically that changes the relationship from I'm going out to battle every day, I got to get geared up. I mean, who knows what I'm facing? And as Amy said, that's a little bit understandable because unlike firefighters and emergency medical personnel who see humans at the most vulnerable.
Right.
Police tend to see human beings at their worst.
Right.
They tend to experience the dark side of human nature.
Mhm.
And so it's hard not to, over time, get a little brittle and cynical. But if you bring to that racist attitudes toward your own, to the community you're working for and serving, that's a lethal combination. And so I just think I have seen where community-based policing makes all the difference in the world in terms of the bond that can be formed between that community and the police department. A cop on a bicycle you relate to very differently than a cop who comes by in a squad car.
Yeah.
Right.
Just to pick an example. So, I mean, I think there are big and little things we can do,
Right.
but fundamentally, we also need to make sure that police departments do reflect the nature of the community they serve. And we can't have, you know, overwhelmingly white police departments all over America, irrespective of the complexion. I don't mean color just, but the diversity of the communities they serve.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's so critical. And we are, you know, a majority minority county, and we're Virginia's first majority minority county. And this is the second largest jurisdiction in the state. And so I think we're in a position to really lead. This has been and continues to be a really amazing conversation. I want to say this. I think it's critical for everyone that's joining us on YouTube and joining us on Facebook Live to know that these are real people that we're talking to, that you can reach out to them, you can connect with them. They represent you, they serve you. They've been elected or appointed to positions of responsibility or been called to positions of responsibility to engage in our community. It's critical that we demonize no one and that we deify no one. We shouldn't demonize the police and we shouldn't deify the police. They are human beings. And all of these amazing leaders that are on this call, we're all human beings in a community, and we all happen to be in this community together. And so there is a mutuality, as Reverend Bailey mentioned, that Dr. King talked about, that we all have with each other. I wanted to ask you in our final few minutes, if I can ask each one of you just to give us a final thought that you'd want to give to the community as we're talking about these issues. And again, Supervisor Bailey, thank you so much for convening us to have this conversation. It's conversations like this, I think, that inspire us, that encourage us, that inform us, and I hope really motivate us to get involved and engage in our community. So thank you so much for doing that. But I just wanted to offer everyone a final word of encouragement or insight that you wanted to give us. And I wanted to see if we could start with Public Defender Lenox, if you wouldn't mind just starting us off with your final word.
Sure. I think that it's incredibly important that every white person out there makes themselves available as an ally to our communities in this county. And we have to change the culture of the police department. And one of the most fundamental ways to do that is to change the work of the police department. And that's what we should all be pushing for. This is going to take a lot of time and a lot of persistent energy, and we can do it if we do it together.
Awesome.
Awesome.
That's awesome. And Commonwealth Attorney Ashworth, what would you say, ma'am?
You know, this is a community effort. It's going to take leaders like us and the other board members to make these changes. It's going to take changes not only at the leadership level of the police department, but the police officers themselves. And it's going to take our community coming together, coming to these town halls, getting out and voting, being in touch with organizations that, you know, if you feel strongly about guns or drugs or anything, there is a group for you. Leaders like us and the other board members to make these changes. It's going to take changes not only at the leadership level of the police department, but the police officers themselves. And it's going to take our community coming together, coming to these towns. So I think people should get involved and come out to meetings and just stay involved, and we can all make this a better place for all of us to live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Reverend Bailey, what would you say to that? What would be your final word of encouragement to us?
So just a few thoughts, Pastor Will. You know, this conversation is centered largely around relationship with police and the police department here in Prince William, and you know the towns and the cities as well. And that is what this moment in our history is largely about. Right. You know, brutality. At the same time, social justice in general is even broader than that. And I hear Attorney Lenox, you know, use the term ally, which, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement has really coined the phrase about allies of the movement. I think at even a different level, I won't say higher level, that we need to understand that social justice is in fact a responsibility of us all. As we go back to the true meaning of those things that Dr. King said, and I've come to understand the responsibility of social justice. I can encompass it in 4 different areas, if you will. That it's about access. You know, we use the term equality, but I like the term equity better, because you know, equality implies that you and I will be treated exactly the same. Well, your parent is taller than I am, and you're, you know, 15, 20 years younger than I am. I don't want to be treated like you, and you don't want to be treated like me. We want to be treated in the way that we have our needs to be treated.
That's right.
Equity. Okay. And that's the second thing then, the equity that each and every person needs. It's about rights, you know, effective legal, industrial, and political rights. And lastly, it's about participation. That gets around to the point that Attorney said, participation in ensuring human and civil rights for every person. That's when we achieve that mutuality of responsibility for what our maker decided we would do. If we were all supposed to be the same, we would all have the same texture of hair. We'd have all the same skin color, all look the same. But the marvelous maker made us different in order to give us a continual test. This moment is about will we pass that test?
That's exactly right. You know, I appreciate everything that you said, Reverend. And Congressman, you know, we really appreciate how you represent us and represent our community, and your commitment to really being engaged in our community. You know, your efforts to put forward and to co-sponsor this bill, you know, on justice and policing. And I know that we've got quite a ways to go. But I'd love to hear your final thoughts to us as well.
You know, I'm Cozy Bailey talked about such a time. I'm going to steal that, Cozy. That's going to be the theme of a speech, if not a book.
Yeah.
As long as you attribute it, I'm fine with it.
Oh yeah, and trust me, I'm a politician. I wouldn't lie about that. But I think back to when I was in high school and college. I was 18 when Martin Luther King was killed, and a few months later, Robert Kennedy was killed, and it felt like hope died.
Right.
Mhm.
To make it all perfect, we elected Richard Nixon president. And we got 7 more years of that horrible war. And the initiation of the Southern strategy to exploit racism for political gain.
Mhm.
And here we are 50 years later, only I feel it's different.
Right.
I feel we have a great opportunity as a country
Yeah.
to actually make a huge leap forward. We're not going to solve everything, but we can change everything.
Yeah.
And I, going back to such a time, I devoted all of my public life to promoting social justice. That's why I'm in it. I studied for the Catholic priesthood and really got into the social justice doctrine of my church. And that imbues me every day. I might not have made a good priest, but the social justice stuff stuck. And so I feel privileged to be alive at this moment and in my position to be able to effectuate change and promote it and
Yeah.
pursue it. And I'm going to do that to my dying breath.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I'm so grateful that we're able to have this conversation. I think for me, what I would share before I hand the baton back to Supervisor Bailey, who initiated this conversation with all of us, is we're all in this fight together. And I think it's important that we recognize that this is not a fight for Blue America or Red America, for Democrats or for Republicans. This is not a fight for one racial group over another racial group or just for one racial group's purposes. This is a fight for all of us. And, this is the community where I live. This is where I'm raising my 17-year-old son and my 12-year-old daughter. And I care a lot about the culture of policing because I have a 17-year-old that will be driving and a 12-year-old in a couple of years that will be driving as well and be living in this community and calling this community home. And so I care about what's going on here. I care about the folks that are here on this call. And I really appreciate and commend your willingness to get into the arena. It's easy to criticize people that get into the arena, but, and whether you stand or fall, the fact that you're willing to get into the arena and, and serve as a supervisor and lead the NAACP and, head up the public defender's office and serve as the chief law enforcement officer and serve in Congress, or however you're called to serve. And we haven't given up on you, Congressman, that you could make a good priest yet. It's not over. There's
God bless you, my son.
Still a chance, still pulling for it. And I got good money on the fact that Reverend Bailey still has some work for you. And but I'll say this: we're all in this fight together, and I think we have to recognize we have common cause with our common humanity. And I'm grateful as a faith leader in this community that leads a congregation that is diverse, politically and religiously and ethnically diverse. Hopefully not religiously diverse, and hopefully we just have the one religion within our church. But I'm grateful for our congregation and for my friends and my neighbors that we would have folks like you that are willing to serve. And I look forward to us continuing conversations like this and seeing true change. I appreciate what Congressman Connally said when he said, we can't solve everything, but we sure can change everything. And I think we're definitely at a time of change. And I look forward to what 2020 and beyond promises as we are willing to keep stepping into the arena. And I'm glad to be in the arena with all of you. Supervisor Bailey, thank you for convening this meeting. You have the final word, ma'am.
Bless you, Pastor. There's a passage in the Bible that says, I once called you servant, but now I call you friend. And so for everyone that's on the screen tonight, I'm so thankful that you are my friend, that we can work arm in arm together, heart to heart, and understand the needs of the people and serve without any reservation. I want to encourage all of you to keep fighting the good fight. And we know on this panel, whenever one calls, we will come because that's just who we are. I want to encourage the community. particularly the community leaders, to use the past as a catalyst to remove fear and move forward. Just move forward, because once you remove the fear, you'll see that you've been fearful for no reason, that we are all human beings, one and the same. And so for the community leaders, keep fighting, keep engaging, don't stop, even if it doesn't look like it should look. That means you're in the right place at the right time. And so I'm grateful that we've had this opportunity to come together and to educate our community and to build a bridge and to build trust in our community. And for the police department, know that we are right there with you. Nobody's perfect, as President Bailey said, nobody's perfect, even us. But we will continue to work with you to make our communities even better, not just locally, but nationally as well. So thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. We wish you the best and the best of health in this COVID season. God bless.
Bless it.